Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 10th annual film and discussion series, Changing the Rules Before the Game is Over. Brought to you by the Woodstock Land Conservancy, Woodstock Transition, and the Woodstock Jewish Congregation. Our event tonight is meeting New York's ambitious climate goals, conflict, compromise, and NIMBY in renewable energy siting. We are particularly excited to present it because we will be addressing what is happening in our beloved Hudson Valley in implementing the New York State Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act of 2019, CLCPA, otherwise known simply as the Climate Act. It is the most ambitious, hopeful, and solution-oriented legislation in the United States for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and we are lucky tonight to have two of the climate leaders in the Hudson Valley to speak about it. Our first speaker is Jen Metzger, a former state senator who was a major force in creating the act. She is currently senior advisor to the New Yorkers for Clean Power. Jen will talk about the basic provisions of the act and its implementation and the variety of solar farms that are springing up. Our second speaker is Audrey Friedrichsen, land use and environmental advocacy attorney for Scenic Hudson, another major player in this field. She will be focusing on where solar farms will go, who will make the decisions, and what we can do to become part of the process. After their very expert presentations, we are going to open up to Q&A for about 40 minutes. So please put your questions as they occur to you into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. This will be a very exciting presentation about a really complicated set of issues, and we're hoping for and expecting lots and lots of questions. Although this event is free, we are inviting you to make a donation, for it will help keep these events coming. You can find the link for donations in the chat, also at the bottom of your page. Again, our sponsors for the 10th annual film and discussion series are the Woodstock Land Conservancy, Woodstock Transition, and the Woodstock Jewish Congregation. Woodstock Land Conservancy is a nonprofit organization committed to the protection and preservation of the open lands, forests, water resources, scenic areas, and historic sites in Woodstock and the surrounding area. Woodstock Transition is part of the global transition town movement of communities working to reimagine and rebuild our world in response to the challenges of our time. Woodstock Transition has 7 active working groups who engage locally. The Woodstock Jewish Congregation is committed to the Torah's teaching that humans are to be Shomrei Adamah, guardians of the earth. It strives to become a model of environmental stewardship within the congregation and for the larger community. And now for Jen Metzger. Jen Metzger.
First of all, I just want to thank Gail for that great introduction, and also just once again thank the Woodstock Land Conservancy, Woodstock New York Transition, and Woodstock Jewish Congregation for hosting this event. It's on such an important subject. In the next 20 minutes, I'm going to talk with you about all of the collective project we have before us to drastically reduce greenhouse gas emissions associated with fossil fuels, which are already taking an enormous toll on the planet and people's health and well-being. And in fact, the International Panel, Scientific Panel on Climate Change just issued a report today documenting the devastating effects that climate change is already having. This effort to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels is going to involve transformational changes in our society. And it's going to take the engagement of all of our communities to succeed. So I'm also going to give tonight a kind of a primer, as Gail said, on renewable energy and the different types of renewable energy projects, and some of the ways that we as individuals and collectively as communities can play an active role in the clean energy transition. Before handing off to Audrey, and then Audrey will get into the really important issues of land use planning and some other issues. It really graphically illustrates the enormous unprecedented impact we've had on global temperatures in a very short period of time. According to the IPCC, we are on course to exceed a 2 degrees Celsius change in global mean temperature in this century putting us on a very dangerous course unless we steeply reduce emissions in the coming decades, particularly of carbon dioxide and methane. So as Gail mentioned, in New York, we were really rising to the challenge. I had the great privilege of working on the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act when I was in the Senate, and it really is one of the strongest pieces of climate legislation in the country. It commits our state to reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2030, in 8 years, below 1990 levels, and to achieving net zero emissions by 2050. It also commits us to generating 70% of our electricity from renewable resources by 2030 and achieving a fossil fuel-free electricity system by 2040. That is not very far away. And importantly, the climate law commits us to a just and equitable transition and dedicates 35% of the benefits of clean energy investments to disadvantaged communities with the goal of 40%. The climate law established a climate action council that has been developing the plan to meet these ambitious goals. And we're going to talk a bit more about this process at the end because the plan is now open for public comment. But the point I want to make here is that the solutions to reduce emissions from carbon intensive sources are buildings and transportation, which make up the lion's share of our emissions, are going to require electricity-based technologies. An analysis that was performed for the Climate Action Council estimated that in this decade alone, we will need to electrify 1 to 2 million homes with heat pumps and replace about 3 million gas vehicles on the road with electric vehicles. So these are huge changes, and they have major implications for our electricity system. This is a bar graph from the analysis that was done for the Climate Action Council, showing the changes that will need to be made to achieve a carbon-free system, while also meeting a greatly increased demand for electricity from electrifying our homes and transportation and all buildings. The different colors in these bars are the different electricity sources in our state's electricity supply. I know it's a little bit hard to read, but the dark gray on the left is fossil fuels, which you can see shrinks down to zero by 2040. The yellow and the different shades of blues are solar and wind, which increased dramatically. And you can see that by 2050, the electricity supply needed to meet New York demand has almost doubled from today. So this is all critically important context for today's discussion, because we have to greatly expand clean renewable sources of energy in New York in order to meet these goals. Now, I know this seems like a lot of change in a fairly short period of time, but the wider benefits to our society beyond reducing climate damaging emissions are really tremendous. Fossil fuels generate a lot of emissions besides carbon emissions that pollute our air and are responsible for many illnesses and premature deaths, especially in low-income communities and communities of color. Eliminating these emissions will avoid tens of thousands of premature deaths, thousands of non-fatal heart attacks, thousands of other hospitalizations, thousands of asthma-related emergency room visits, hundreds of thousands of lost workdays. It's been estimated that the savings from avoided healthcare costs alone of shifting to a clean energy economy is estimated to be about $50 to $150 billion by 2050. The clean energy transition is also going to create hundreds of thousands of jobs. So instead of sending our dollars out of New York to pay for fossil fuels, we'll be creating good paying clean energy jobs right here in New York. So I just want to give you a sense of where we get our electricity from now. And I again apologize, it's a little bit hard to read these graphs, but the top outer green part of the circle shows that 55% of electricity comes from zero carbon resources. The vast majority of this, though, is nuclear and hydro that we've had for a very long time. Only about 5% is from wind and solar. And we still depend on fossil fuels, mostly fossil gas, for 43% of our electricity. And in fact, that dependence has increased a bit since 2019 with the closure of Indian Point. So that was the statewide picture. These graphs show you how the sources of electricity differ upstate and downstate. Here in the Mid-Hudson region, we are in Zone G, which is part of the downstate grid. And you will notice that we rely on fossil fuels, mostly fossil gas, for 77% of our electricity, because most of that hydro is located upstate. The good news is that the mix of energy resources is changing. In 2015, the Public Service Commission established the Clean Energy Standard, which requires utilities and energy supply companies to procure increasing amounts of electricity from renewable resources over time. It also subsidizes existing nuclear facilities, just another story. After the climate law was passed, the Clean Energy Standard was updated to ensure that utilities and energy supply companies are procuring enough renewable energy to meet our goal of generating 70% of our electricity from renewable resources by 2030. And as of today, projects have been contracted or are in development that actually get us to 50%. They just have to get built. Last year, 19 large-scale renewable generation projects were under construction, which was the most active construction year to date. Okay, I'm going to now turn to the different types of renewable projects, but it's important that you have a sense of what a megawatt is for this discussion. Renewable projects are often described in terms of megawatts if they are larger systems, or kilowatts if they are smaller systems. A watt is a measure of power. So a 1 megawatt solar array can produce up to 1 megawatt of power, which is equivalent to 1,000 kilowatts. And 1,000,000 watts. And just to put it in perspective, a rooftop solar system on a home is like 6 or 7 kilowatts. So a megawatt is quite a bit bigger. So to help you picture what a megawatt of solar looks like, it's helpful to know that you typically need about 6 acres of land for 1 megawatt of solar. So how many homes can a megawatt of solar power? I have seen estimates ranging from 160 to 250 for different projects. And a megawatt of wind can actually power even more homes because it generates more electricity over a year. So there are 2 broad categories of renewable resources: large scale, sometimes also referred to as utility scale, and distributed. Large-scale renewables are interconnected to the transmission system, which carries electricity within and across the state, as well as between states. This is what New York's transmission system looks like. Large-scale renewable facilities can range in size from 25 megawatts to hundreds of megawatts. So these are very big projects. Distributed renewable resources are interconnected to the local grid or distribution system. It's a much more decentralized system than large-scale generation and transmission. Distributed renewable systems can be, they can also be, what you would probably consider big. They can be, 5, 10, 15 megawatts, or they can be very small, like just a few kilowatts on a rooftop. So solar, wind, and hydropower, all of these types of renewable energy, they can be large scale or on the transmission system, or they can be smaller scale projects on the distribution system. So in the Hudson Valley, the two large-scale solar projects were recently approved by the state for Greene County, and one project in Columbia County is currently under review. Generally speaking, though, large-scale renewable development in the Hudson Valley is likely to be limited. There are factors affecting developers' decisions about siting projects that just make other areas of the state more attractive, mainly north and west of us. The top factor is proximity to the transmission system, but they also have to have enough suitable available land near the transmission system to support these larger projects, which can be harder to find here. Solar projects can take up many hundreds of acres of land at a utility scale level. And land also costs more in our region. So this map is from a recent American Farmland Trust report, and it's based on data from the New York Independent System Operator. And it shows you by county how many megawatts of utility scale projects have been proposed as of August 2021. And as you can see, these projects are really concentrated in certain counties in the northern and western part of the state where there's a lot more open, flat, or generally sort of gently sloping land near transmission lines. So the red counties are the counties with 1,000 to 1,200 and 5,600 megawatts of proposed, probably mostly solar power. And the Hudson Valley, if you look down at the Hudson Valley, there's virtually no proposed projects for the region. There's no question that the kind of land that is most impacted by large-scale renewable development and also by community renewable projects, which we'll talk about in a minute, is agricultural land. And that's because it's open land. It's typically fairly flat, and you don't have to cut down a lot of forest for it. One underexplored avenue in New York is agrovoltaics, which can help minimize the trade-off among competing land uses by co-locating renewable energy with agricultural production. Other countries where land is more scarce than here, like Japan and Germany, are kind of further down the road in promoting agrovoltaics. It's still very much in the early stages here, and the predominant agricultural activity in New York has been co-locating sheep grazing with solar. There are currently about 1,000 acres of solar in New York that includes sheep grazing. But there's the potential for cultivating crops on solar sites and for beekeeping and even other types of livestock grazing if the projects are designed for it. Audrey and I both sit on an advisory group to NYSERDA that's focused on responsible siting of solar projects with respect to agriculture. And this group is providing input on a new NYSERDA agrivoltaic incubator program. We're also providing input on a scorecard that will be used to evaluate a renewable project's impacts on environmental and agricultural resources. I'm going to add links to the chat in a bit about where you can find information both about this working group and also about a recent study that was done on solar grazing. But I really think that agrivoltaics offers a huge opportunity, but we also have to do everything we can to make sure that projects are appropriately and responsibly sited, and we're reducing conflict between the needs for food production and energy production. So as I mentioned, distributed renewable projects are far more common in our area than large-scale renewable projects. The most common are customer-sited solar arrays. These are typically rooftop systems or ground-mounted on the property. The distinguishing feature is that the power is being generated at the point of use, at your home, at your business, at a school. If you're using that power during the day, that's less electricity that has to be transmitted on the grid, which is a great thing for the grid because it reduces the electricity load. And it also reduces your monthly utility bills, which is a great thing. As we transition to heat pumps for our homes and electric vehicles, it's going to be that much more beneficial to have solar at our homes and workplaces. And if you pair solar with battery storage, you can use the energy you generate when the sun goes down, as well as bolster your resilience to power outages like we just had during these recent ice storm. Our power was out for about 72 hours. So the benefits to households and to our communities of on-site renewables are many. The reality, though, is that many people can't have on-site solar either because their houses may not be sited well for it. They may have too many trees, or they may rent their home, or they may not be able to afford the upfront costs. Community renewable generation, also called community distributed generation, is meant to provide wider access to the benefits of renewable energy by enabling residents and businesses to participate in a renewable project at another location. The energy generated from those projects feeds into the local grid. They can be up to 5 megawatts in size, though they don't have to be. That's what they're the maximum they are allowed to be. And they can be, sited in different ways. I just wanted to show you a few different pictures. So, typically in our area, we see the kind of developments that you see in the lower right, which is, in green fields. But they could also be on rooftops. They could be carports. It typically costs more to do those kinds of installations, but these are all possibilities for what community renewables can look like. So there are different models of community solar. The most common is a subscription model. Basically, you're subscribing to a facility for the amount of power you would need for your home, and you receive a credit for the value of your share of that energy on your utility bill. The projects typically guarantee that your participation will result in a 10% discount on your utility bills. Participating in these projects has actually just been made a lot easier by the Public Service Commission. It's required the utilities to implement consolidated billing. So you don't have to send a separate payment to the project sponsor. The utility will just net out that payment and you just get a credit on your utility bills. So it's a great way to support local renewable development and get a modest bill discount if you can't site solar or renewable energy on your home. And the last kind of renewable community program I wanted to mention is community choice aggregation. I know this is probably a whole separate webinar, but we really wanted to give you kind of a broad brush look at all of the different ways to support renewable energy locally. So community choice aggregation is a way to leverage community buying power over electricity supply and can help support a carbon-free grid. In a community choice aggregation program, the utility continues to be responsible for the poles and the wires and the billing, but the municipality or a group of municipalities, rather than the utility, is contracting the supply for residents and businesses. When a community launches a CCA program, residents and businesses are automatically enrolled in it unless they choose to opt out and remain with the utility. In the Hudson Valley, there are close to 40 communities participating in CCAs right now. Around 10 municipalities participate in a CCA administered by Joule Assets, a company that offers CCA administration services. And another 28 municipalities participate in Westchester Power, which is administered by the nonprofit Sustainable Westchester. The vast majority of these communities have opted for 100% renewable supply. And in New York, CCAs are required to, basically they're required to support new renewable projects that are built in New York State. This is very different from CCA programs in other states, So you really are supporting the goals of our climate law and reaching our emissions targets through a 100% renewable option. A fairly new development in CCAs in New York is that they'll be able to integrate community renewable projects into their opt-out offerings, so that you're not just supporting renewable projects somewhere in New York State, you're also supporting local projects while getting a discount on your bill. I think CCA offers a lot of opportunities. I think we've hardly scratched the surface in New York, especially if they're locally administered. They could play a role in our communities in promoting energy efficiency, in undertaking climate and energy education, and really engaging our communities in this project of transforming our local energy system. And energy planning, which is a good segue to Audrey's presentation. So I'm going to take a pause there and pass the baton to Audrey.
Great. Thank you very much, Jen. As Gail mentioned at the outset, so hopefully everybody can hear me. My name is Audrey Friedrichsen. I am the land use and environmental advocacy attorney at Scenic Hudson. Thank you very much to the Woodstock Land Conservancy, Woodstock Transition, and Woodstock Jewish Congregation for the invitation and ability to speak. So as Gail mentioned at the outset, what I will talk about is what you as individuals and residents of the Hudson Valley and beyond the Hudson Valley can do to help promote smart solar siting. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen as well. And hopefully everybody can see that. Great. I have a little notice that everyone can see my application. So again, I work for Scenic Hudson. If anybody is not familiar with Scenic Hudson, we are a well-established, well over 50-year-old environmental organization. And what we do is a few things. We conserve land, we create parks, and what I do is mostly on the advocacy end of things, where we both fight threats, but also we seek to promote well-sited renewable energy. So as Jen mentioned, right, the real issue here is how do we get all of this built? Where is it going to go? How do we make sure that it goes to the right places and that we get all of the advantages of clean energy and make sure that it doesn't have any undue impacts on our ecology, our agriculture, and other systems. So at Scenic Hudson, what we've been really working on and thinking about and really believe in is that the Hudson Valley can be a leader, right? It can be a leader and a model for this transition. And as Jen mentioned, for the most part, the large scale solar energy projects are not going to be seen here in the Hudson Valley. A couple have been approved. There's one still under review, and we'll actually talk about that some more in a minute. But for the most part, those the kind of solar energy projects that we're going to see are those distributed ones that Jen defined for us and described as the ones that interconnect into the distribution system. And what has recently happened is Governor Hochul announced an increase of a target of 6 gigawatts, right? So that's 6,000 megawatts to 10 gigawatts, right? So the state now has a program in place to try and support those distributed solar energy projects. And now our goal has increased another 4 gigawatts, right? And so here in the Hudson Valley, what we expect is those solar developments. We don't have much wind resource, and they're going to be primarily what they call commercial industrial projects, which are somewhere up to 750 kilowatts, and community solar projects that Jen described for us. And for the most part, those are around 5 megawatts. And so really what we can do here in the Hudson Valley is model a swift and just transition, right? And at the same time, we can conserve our natural resources and get those economic benefits. So the real question is, how do we do that? And what everybody sort of came for today and what was intimated by the title of today's talk, one of the issues is what they call NIMBYism, right? Not in my backyard. And I have to say, I have heard it many, many times where people say, well, I support renewable energy, just not here, right? And what I did was pull a few of the headlines out of the news for you. And, there's a few lessons to be learned here. This is not an issue that is unique to New York. On the bottom right, you can see a headline from Indiana. We can see issues that pop up with opposition to renewable energy projects all over in Ohio. I've seen it in Virginia, Maine, Massachusetts. So it's not unique to New York. One of the other things is you can see here the GRIST article, right? It mentions a birding group that is trying to stop wind energy, right? It's difficult when you are an organization that works and your mission is based on environmental protection with a certain focus, right? But at the same time, renewable energy, which has climate benefits, might put organizations into a difficult position. And just very recently, I happened to hear this on the morning edition of NPR. In the middle, there was a news report about misinformation, right? Renewable energy is not safe from the info wars that we have been seeing and across all parts of our society, right? And so a lot of the information that we hear may actually be misinformation about renewable energy. And if you have a chance to Google and find that and listen to that, I would highly recommend it. And then the project that Jen mentioned that is currently being reviewed and is proposed for Columbia County in the town of Copake, that Hudson Valley 360 article, right? What happened there? A group formed to support the project, a group formed to oppose the project. There's competing lawn signs, and it was picked up even by the New York Times, right? And so I think that we see a kind of a plethora of these kinds of headlines because this is the kind of thing that sounds like news, right? It creates a controversy, and that's what reporters are interested in writing about. But there is actually good news that might not get so much coverage. And in the case of that project up in Copake, what has actually happened is the opposing groups have gotten together and in a collaborative process supported by landscape architects, designers, the Columbia Land Conservancy, the local land trust on the ground, have gotten together and made recommendations to the developer for a vision for the project that they see as a win-win for their community, right? So it might sound like this is a big issue and this is the thing that gets interest and headlines, but there are actually solutions and collaborative opportunities available, and we can create those win-win solutions and find places where we can do things like agrovoltaics and co-location, as Jen mentioned. So like I said, there are solutions, and like I promised, I will tell you how you can get involved, right? And we really want you to. So my little list of things to do here, first of all, learn, right? Learn what you can. You're already here, so you're already taking that first step. Learn some more. One of the most informational things to look at is to see what at your local government level, the zoning laws and the plans say about renewable energy. And that's something you can use Google to look up and find and see whether or not your town has a law that either promotes or blocks renewable energy, right? Talk to your neighbors, educate yourself and educate others. And then, the action that you can take, you can go to municipal meetings and other kinds of meetings and speak up there for your support for well-sited renewable energy. There are conservation advisory councils. That's what the CIC stands for. There are also climate smart communities task forces that are getting formed under state programs. And those are all at the local level. That is something that you can join or form. And those kinds of organizations can do work to promote renewable energy. I kind of put this in here as sort of tongue in cheek, but you can become a solar influencer, right? If you are on Facebook or on Instagram or on Twitter, right? Or even if you are not posting yourself, you can look for others who are posting about it and share that kind of information. And last but not least, right? You can get elected to a position on your town or village or city board, or be appointed to something like a planning board or zoning board. So that, in addition to just sort of your own individual activism and educating yourself, there are many avenues where you can get involved and learn, and then help to promote smart renewable energy siting. So I know that what Jen threw at you was a lot of information very quickly, and I am now also going to do the same. It's going to be sort of an alphabet soup, but at the same time as folks at the local level, right, which is literally where the shovel goes in the ground, and if we need to get these projects built, it's very important. We should also understand that a lot of people, a lot of agencies, employees at the state level are being leveraged, and they are conducting both market development and planning processes that are creating the framework for getting all of this renewable energy built. So one of the first ones is called ORES, the Office of Renewable Energy Siting. It was recently created, and under a new law, there is now a permitting processes for those large projects that Jen described that hook into the transmission system. And that new law has set out a set of standards, uniform standards and conditions, or we call them USCs. And any project that enters into that permitting process has to comply with those uniform standards and conditions from the get-go. And those impact anything from agricultural lands to wetlands to forests to local traffic systems to the electric system. But there's a set of standards that those projects need to comply with. As I mentioned, for distributed energy, there is what they call the New York Sun program. And that program actually builds into the compensation structure incentives that help to promote systems that will benefit LMI, lower middle income communities, systems that will get built on brownfields, meaning that they are going to not take up new green land, but we will be built on previously disturbed land, and also support building those community solar projects that Jen described, which are projects that people can tap into and get the credit for clean energy, even if you can't put it on your own roof. And then a few other projects or processes that are going on this at the state level that, it sounds like it's the Wild West out there, but there really isn't. There are a lot of planning processes going on. For one, they are promoting transmission into New York City of clean energy. And the purpose there is to eliminate the polluting peaker plants that are sited in environmental justice communities down there. So that is one process, bringing in clean energy to New York. There is a coordinated grid planning process going on, and that is looking at the transmission and the distribution systems and asking the question, how do these need to be upgraded in order to allow for all of this new renewable energy to go on? So someone's planning that process. We also have a storage target, right? Solar and wind is not always on. So we need storage to be able to handle those times. So there's planning for that target. There is what they call a build ready program. So the state has asked for people to identify sites where there's already been disturbance. Maybe it's an old defunct shopping mall, or it's a brownfield site, or it's a closed landfill, or it's a closed mine. And so they're looking to find those sites, get them permitted, and then turn it over to a developer in a shovel-ready state to get those built. Of course, this is something that was just in the news yesterday and today, OSW, or offshore wind. We have a huge offshore wind goal, and they just had a big auction to lease sites for that. That was very successful. So we will also be getting renewable energy from there. This is what they call VDER, value of distributed energy resources. So those distributed projects, what this program does is make sure they get compensated correctly for where they're located and the environmental benefits of those things. And then information integrated energy data resource, right? All of this planning, all of this construction, all of this building, we need the data to be able to support that, about what the land is like, about what the energy system is like. So the state is working to make that data available to all stakeholders. As Jen mentioned, the issue of agricultural impacts is being looked at very closely by the state, and she and I are both on what they call the ATWIG, the Agricultural Technical Working Group, which, as she described, we are looking into ways to make sure that the goals of achieving our renewable energy targets and our goals of supporting and maintaining a healthy and viable agricultural system are both achieved at the same time. And then sort of last but not least here, right, in all of these market and planning processes, as Jen mentioned, the Climate Action Council, which was created by the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, has recently issued a scoping plan. And one of the main recommendations in there was that a mapping tool be created. And what that would do is that the state would create this tool, and information in that tool would then be given to municipal representatives. It would travel down to the local level so that they can make informed land use decisions and communicate their local wants to developers. Because the approval process for those distributed energy projects will go through at the local level. So let's talk about planning at the local level. At Scenic Hudson, we have worked for the last several years to try and create toolkits and information and guides and best practices and recommendations for use by local decision makers, right? And for residents, people like yourselves, whether or not you look at it, in your individual capacity, whether you do something like join a CAC or a Climate Smart Communities Task Force, or whether you are, you become a part of a planning process. And so we looked at this issue of how and where to best site solar energy projects, especially in the Hudson Valley. And we came up with a 4-part planning process. And the first question is, what is already on the land, right? Let's take a look at how our community is already developed. Obviously, someplace like the city of Kingston or the city of Beacon is going to be different than someplace like the town of Washington, right? Or an open, more agricultural community in Orange County. So what are the existing land use patterns? And then the next is, let's find the low-hanging fruit, right? Where are the opportunities that have already been disturbed and really places that make sense to build solar right from the get-go? And that can include parking lots or rooftops. There are a couple of great examples here in the Hudson Valley, and this is only 2 of them, where municipalities have sited solar on closed local landfills. The top one here in the picture is in Saugerties, and the one on the bottom is right here where I am in the city of Beacon. Those are kind of no-brainers, right? We have these closed areas, they're already open and cleared of trees. And if there is available infrastructure, and you can connect them into the grid, it certainly makes sense to put solar energy there, and they bring benefits to the municipalities that had them built. Then the third question in the planning process, okay, now that we've seen what's already on the ground, where are the no-brainer low-hanging fruit places to site solar? Then the next question is, all right, where are the important natural and agricultural and other resources that we want to protect? And in this way, solar energy is no different from any other kind of development, right? Whether it's a strip mall or a subdivision or apartment complexes, right? We want to not have undue impacts on the important sites. But the thing that is unique to solar energy and renewable energy is the last question, is where can we connect it into the grid? And actually, that is probably the first question that a developer asks. But we think of it from this sort of flipped on its head point of view from planning. So that's sort of a 4-part approach to thinking about where solar can go at the local level, right? And so as residents of communities here in the Hudson Valley, this is something that you can start to think about right away, drive around, see what things look like, where might it make sense, right? So there's a lot of resources out there. You heard Jen mention the alphabet soup here of NYSERDA. That is the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. It's sort of the main agency in New York State that is really working to get renewable energy built. They have a guidebook for local governments. There are at the state level a couple of programs to promote climate action, the Climate Smart Communities and Clean Energy Communities programs. The Hudson Valley Regional Council, they actually have people on staff that can help communities sign up for those programs. And then some really other good resources in thinking about planning for local energy development. There are planning departments that exist at the county level, and then your own local town planning and zoning departments, right? Those are the folks who know the town very well and know what your local laws and your local plans say. And so in the context of all of those other resources, Scenic Hudson put together a toolkit, which we call How to Solar Now, that has a few resources in it to really sort of put the fine details on this planning process. So I'll describe those really quickly, and then hopefully we can get into a nice robust Q&A. I see we have some questions lined up already. So our How to Solar Now toolkit is really meant to help stakeholder decision making. And again, it's online, it's available to anyone. You can look at it tomorrow. You can point it out to your the officials or the appointed folks or the employees at your town level as something that might be useful when thinking about how we can plan and get the local codes in place to really help get these distributed energy solar projects built and built in the right places here in the Hudson Valley. So there are 3 resources in this How to Solar Now toolkit. One is a siting guide. It contains some principles about where projects may or may not go. The second is some best practices for solar zoning. And the last is a solar mapping tool, which is actually sort of a smaller version of what the state has now called for in that scoping plan. So very quickly, I'll talk about each of them. One of the first things we created was this idea of how to promote what we call smart from the start solar planning, right? So the idea is if you can, following a set of clear principles and strategies for solar siting, avoid conflicts, right? Minimize impacts right at the outset. What that should do is create projects that will have more of a glide path through the permitting process, right? They will be better received by the public. It's because then the process for review will go that much more quickly. There will be less cost, less delay. And ultimately the goal through smart siting is to help us achieve our renewable energy goals, right? And as Jen outlined at the very beginning, not only do we need to electrify everything, if we're going to switch to a carbon-free energy system, we need even more supply, right, in order to meet that demand. And I think somebody already asked a question about energy efficiency, and yes, that also needs to happen, right? So this is just our guide with a set of siting principles in the interest of making it all a much better project from the start. We also put together some recommendations for solar zoning. And I recognize that zoning is kind of this sort of esoteric thing that, you know, maybe a lot of people have heard about, but don't really think about. But it's something that I think about on a daily basis. And really, like I said, your local code is what dictates where the shovel goes in the ground. To me, it's sort of the very first line of how we make sure that things get built in the right place. And you know, a couple of key recommendations in a suggested process for establishing solar zoning are places where local voices and public input is very important, and opportunities for folks like yourself to get involved. And the number one is for the community to be pro-solar, to even get the town board to adopt a resolution that says, look, we support solar energy, we support well-sited solar energy, and so we're going to undertake a process to make sure we have codes and plans and process in place to support that. Right. And so a few of the other recommendations here, one of the things, as you know, Jen talked about the idea of growing food and energy, that is something that can be promoted through local codes, right? So this is a set of recommendations for that. And then finally, sort of the big ticket item that we have is Scenic Hudson's solar mapping tool. And for just by, as an aside here, this is a picture of a solar project located in the town of Greenport. You can actually see the transmission lines that cross the Hudson at Athens and Hudson in the background. So a developer came and proposed a project, and it was actually located quite close to a historic resource. So we engaged the developer and worked with them, and they moved around some panels, eliminated some panels. And in the end, we had a much better designed and sited project that went forward, but didn't have any visual impacts on the historic resource nearby. So we like to look at that as sort of another one of our success stories in the Hudson Valley, in addition to things like projects located on landfills. But our solar mapper, very quickly, it looks complicated. It looks like it might be a little intimidating from the start, but really all you need to do is open it up at How to Solar Now and start reading. It has 4 parts. The first one explains solar energy, similar to the way in which Jen did earlier, but with a little bit more detail on what exactly the sizes and technology and kinds of projects we can expect in our New York market. Part 2 is about that solar planning process, those 4 parts, those 4 steps, again, with a little bit more detail. And then what part 3 does is teach you about the geographic information system, the GIS data layers that we have in the mapper. Basically what it does is it takes little bits of information and then puts it on a map in a picture. And I'll show you a screenshot in a minute of what it looks like. And then the 4th part is actually a fully interactive tool that anyone can use, where you can turn the layers on and off and see how they relate to each other and how they relate to building solar energy and how we can get them well sited. So I will just make a few points about using our solar mapping tool. In that planning process, the one thing to not forget is the value of local knowledge and local planning that is already in place. As I mentioned, you know, you are the people who know your towns already best, you and the people who work for the town. So if you do use the solar mapping tool, it's very important to bring local knowledge to the table, in addition to the information that's provided in the mapping tool itself. And so this is just a screenshot of what it looks like, right? On the left is some information and guidance. And this particular screenshot shows what the data looks like when it is actually pictured on a map. And the data here that's being shown is important forest cores and important forests. And the reason why this is relevant is if you build a solar project, or frankly, any kind of development, right, that starts to cut into a forest, what it does is it makes it have more edges, which is less valuable than an intact forest core, right? So that's why it's relevant to land use and why we've included it in the solar mapper. And so forest cores is just one of the data layers that's provided in the mapper. There are also wetlands and agricultural soils and parking lots and large buildings, right? So all of those pieces of information that are useful to you in that 4-part planning process. And then one of the things we are most proud of is that we worked with what they call the joint utilities. So, you know, we're of course most familiar with Central Hudson. There's Orange and Rockland, Con Ed down in the south, and Westchester and towards New York City, NYSEG and National Grid. All of the utilities have been ordered by the state to create what is called hosting capacity mapping. And what it actually is is a picture that shows the distribution lines, right? The places where distributed energy resources like community solar or rooftop solar will need to interconnect. And the color codes of those lines tells you how much room is actually in that line to be able to interconnect. This is a very important piece of information for developers, right? Because it tells them whether or not they can just directly connect in, or if they have to spend some large amount of money to be able to have a system that they can connect to. But from our point of view, this is a really important question when it comes to planning, right? It almost acts as a proxy for land use planning, because even if we take a look at the mapper and we say, hey, this is a place that makes sense to put solar energy, if there isn't the available capacity in the line, then maybe it doesn't. But as I mentioned, there is the coordinated grid planning process, or that CGPP in our alphabet soup going on. So it might actually make sense to plan and zone for solar there, because as they say, if you build it, they will come. So maybe if we get the code in place that promotes a well-sited solar energy project, then the grid will be upgraded to be able to handle that in the future. Right, so those, this is a lot of information very quickly. I think we mentioned this is going to be recorded. Also, feel free to check out How to Solar Now. And so this is the information on sort of the free-for-all when you are able to access the fully interactive map here. And you can zoom in to the particular place where you're interested in looking at, right? Whether it's a particular parcel or the jurisdiction of a town or a village. It shows the various kinds of layers that we have on the bottom. There is the electrical information. There are water resources. There are ecological resources. There are historic resources, right? And you can find the layer that you want to turn on and off down there. And then what's really useful is there is a measuring tool or a draw tool. So you can actually draw on the map and save it as a PDF. And all of this is useful with a worksheet that we provide, that as you go through the mapping tool and you look and you ask yourself those 4 planning questions, you can record that information for use later on. So that's very quickly of the tool. I know it sounds complicated, but really, if you open it up and look at it, it's extremely useful. And I will very quickly make a plug for Jen's group, New Yorkers for Clean Power, and another local environmental group, Clearwater, have been running a cohort where 15 or so representatives of various municipalities around the Hudson Valley have signed up and are together. They walk through using the tool for their particular place that they are interested in. And there was one held in the last quarter of last year. There's another one starting up shortly. And I think after this webinar, if some information is circulated to all, there will be a flyer on that next cohort if you are someone who is interested in participating in that. And so very lastly, the tool also comes with a replication guide, and we are hoping that that will play a role in as the scoping plan recommends to create this map in more regions. So with that, I will leave it, and thank you very much.
There are a lot of questions. Okay, this is one. Why aren't people who have rooftop solar allowed to join community solar for the rest of their energy need?
That's a really good question. And I've heard I've heard that complaint before, and it's definitely something that I don't have the answer for you, I'm afraid. It's something that I've been meaning to look into, and I'm sure it has to do with the utilities, with utility billing, but it should be allowed. It's kind of a ridiculous obstacle, that you can't participate in both. But I don't have the answer as to why it's not allowed.
Okay. Why can't arrays be located under power transmission lines? There are hundreds of miles of lands used for that purpose right under the transmission lines that could be used. And the land is not currently used for agriculture.
Well, that's a very interesting question. I mean, except for the shading from the lines themselves, you know, that would pose some issue. But, you know, it's absolutely correct. It can't be used. That land can't be used for anything else. I don't know technically what the interconnection issues would be, you know, for the transmission system, but it seems perfectly conceivable to me, except for the shading. That's the only thing it would reduce. That would reduce, you know, the amount of power that could be produced. But it's a great suggestion.
These two, are they the sorts of questions that people should send in response to the scoping plan? Say?
You could, yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, absolutely. I was going to provide some information on that, but I'll just quickly say that right now, so this it's a large plan. It's like 330 pages with 500 pages of appendices. It's a big plan that covers basically every aspect of you know, of the climate challenges in New York State and the sources of emissions. But it is probably the most important document in determining whether and how New York will meet its climate goals. And the public comment period, as I mentioned, is open right now. You can submit written comments. I have a slide on that. And you can also, there will be 6 public hearings held around the state in April. They haven't been scheduled yet, but you can sign up for a public hearing. I did a presentation that basically gave an overview of this plan. And I also have a link to that on the slide. And if we can circulate the slides with participants afterward, you can check out the links on the slides, but it covers just about everything. And there's no reason why, you know, you couldn't bring that up then, you know. I mean, I think that's a good place for it.
Okay. Thank you. How many acres in total are estimated to be needed to cover with solar panels to meet the energy requirements for New York State?
Ooh, that's a really good question.
So this is actually something that Scenic Hudson looked into several years ago now, when it was still a 50 by 30 target. And the state at the Public Service Commission, right, which is the arm of the Department of Public Service, which issues the orders under what they call the Clean Energy Standard, right? The 50 by 30 and now the 70 by 30, and also the 100 by 40 that is now codified in the CLCPA. And they conducted an environmental assessment of 50 by 30. And it's actually very complicated modeling that they try and do, where they have to plug in, you know, expected market and costs of this and land prices here and electricity prices there, to try and estimate the sort of mix of energy generation that we're going to have when we get to those targets, right? And so that actually has not been updated for the 70 by 30 or the 100 by 40. So we don't actually have sort of a way to back into how much actual large scale solar is going to be built and then try and figure out how many acres that is. The one thing we could sort of do is look at what is in the queue, as Jen mentioned, Remember, we saw the one map that had the reddish colors upstate. So that might be one way to sort of look at what we have so far and do it. But I don't know that anybody has come up with that acreage. I don't know, Jen, do you?
Well, first of all, I just want to mention, so for the, Audrey talked about the new 10 gigawatts of distributed solar goal that the state has. That's about 15,000 acres of land for meeting that 10 gigawatt goal. And that's just distributed projects, right? Not large scale projects. Of course, that's not just acres of greenfields necessarily, right? It could be Walmart parking lots. It could be a lot of different things. It could be brownfields, but that's the area basically. It's hard to predict the exact mix of resources. I showed you the projections on that bar graph early on in my presentation. There's going to be, it's going to be likely be mostly wind and solar. And solar is cheaper. It's less costly than wind. There's also been a lot of siting issues with wind as well. But we have ambitious offshore wind goals in New York State. We already have almost half of the climate goals offshore wind target contracted already. That's a huge source of power, clean renewable power for our grid. But onshore wind is going to have to play an important role too. It's not just all solar. It's got to be a mix of resources. And somebody had asked earlier, I think it was answered in the chat, why more houses could be powered by a megawatt of wind than a megawatt of solar. And it's because the wind blows more than the sun shines, basically, in a very short way of explaining it. And offshore wind is a more consistent source of wind than onshore wind often. So you can power even more houses in a given year from offshore wind. But these are wind and solar, they're intermittent resources. And they're, we're going to require like 15 to 20 megawatts of storage that has to be built out to support those resources and make sure that, during times of peak demand, we have the storage, we have the capability to tap storage and meet our reliability needs. So there's a lot of work to do, between now and 2040.
Okay.
I'll just jump on real quick. Maxanne had put in the chat. She mentioned that several years ago, there was a group, it was Renewables on the Ground Roundtable, it was called, that was put out by the Nature Conservancy and the Alliance for Clean Energy New York. That's actually where I met Jen.
Yeah, that's right.
Years ago. And Maxanne mentioned that I think the number that had been mentioned when we were doing that work, it was still 50 by 30, was 2% of all the land, all of the land surface in New York. I can't remember, Jen, if that was just solar or if that was solar and land-based wind. But yeah, so.
Yeah, I mean, and remember what I said, at the beginning of the presentation too, all the technologies that we have to shift to are electricity based. So we have to double our electricity production by 2050. To meet the projected needs. And this is going to increase the need, for, expanding space for renewables. There's no question. But I think another question was asked about the solar roadmap, 10, and there are a lot of recommendations kind of on this topic in the draft scoping plan. And I actually pulled out a bunch of the recommendations relating to siting on the slides, which I didn't show you, but you'll be able to look at after this presentation. But, you know, we should be, you know, prioritizing, the state should be prioritizing those kinds of projects that we want to see and that are most beneficial. Projects at the point of use, projects for multifamily housing, low-income housing, public housing projects, that are, co-locate with agriculture. We should be really promoting the kinds of projects that we want to see as a state, and you can weigh in on that in this plan, on the draft scoping plan comments. But we need it all. We can't just have distributed renewables. The challenge that we face in the time frame that we face, it's going to necessitate a mix of large scale and distributed resources. We're just not going to get there one rooftop at a time. It's just not possible. So it's important to keep that in mind, but we have to work collectively to make sure that, we're siting everything in the best possible places. I just want to say one more thing about this. The infrastructure we have now, the fossil fuel infrastructure, it's primarily sited in poor communities, in Black and Brown communities, out of sight, out of mind for most people in New York State who depend upon it. Renewable projects are they're where the sunshine and the wind blows. They're everywhere, and or they can be. But it's important to keep in mind the infrastructure is in our state, and we need to. The beauty of renewable infrastructure is that it doesn't pollute your community. It doesn't cause horrible health problems like fossil fuels do. This is it's definitely most of the challenges are really around changing our landscapes, and I think that's very challenging for people, for all of us, but if we want the lights, if we want the power to go on when we flick the switch, we've got to expand renewable power. So
okay, so you mentioned incentives in several places when you were talking. Here's a specific question. Since putting solar panels over parking lots costs more than putting them in a field, how can developers make this work economically? Where can they get the money to cover this extra cost?
Right, so that goes directly to the incentives and the system, like I mentioned, that exists at least in the New York Sun program. And so there's sort of a base incentive to encourage developers to build distributed energy resources. And then there are additional adders. And like I mentioned, some of them are in the interest of getting energy built in low and middle income communities and making it available there. Some of it is to help build on brownfields. So that is a similar situation to parking lots, right? You can't just drill the racks for the solar arrays into the ground on a landfill. You have to float them on sort of these concrete bathtub looking things. So there is an additional cost there. So that's why there's an incentive to help the developer sort of close the gap to be able to carry the additional cost of building that kind of project. So far, I have not seen a parking lot incentive adder, nor have we seen an agrivoltaics incentive adder. So actually, if you wanted to submit a comment somewhere very soon, right now there is a comment period open on the New York Sun roadmap. It closes on March the 7th, and that might be a place where you would want to tell NYSERDA and the state that, hey, you should be looking to make sure that developers are incentivized to build projects on parking lots and to support agrivoltaics and build that into the New York Sun system.
So Can the link for that be sent to Ellie so that it can be included in the material that's going to be sent to everybody?
Yes, I can.
Thank you. Another question about parking lot. How large a parking lot would be the minimum to be useful?
There's no size limit. It could be any size. You know, and if it's, you know, for on-site consumption, you know, it depends on the load, the electricity load, the electricity demand of the building that it's adjacent to. But, you know, as far as I'm concerned, I mean, we have to build out EV infrastructure. We should, you know, be building out, you know, solar panels with that EV infrastructure so that we're charging the cars. When I was in a Central Hudson rate case, because it was probably now 2 rate cases ago, you know, I was trying to push them to really think out of the box, which never happens, but anyway, and to really incentivize, you know, workplace charging and co-locating workplace charging with solar. I mean, that is really the way to go.
Okay. You talked a bit about the change that Central Hudson is going to be doing in billing, but there are several questions here about people have sent in about their bills. Okay.
Uh-oh. Okay. You know, I will say I'm in a community renewable project. It's actually a community hydro project in the town of Wallkill. There's allegedly consolidated billing now, but you know, our project is not, you know, it hasn't started yet for our project, but eventually it will make it a lot simpler, the billing. But what are the specific questions? Is it about community?
They varied. Hang on. Move up and down here. I think they were mainly in the chat. Okay. I signed up for wind power a few years ago, and a lot of my electric comes from wind, but the bill comes through Central Hudson. One was, how do we get Central Hudson to change the billing so we don't go bankrupt, because they had their recent problem with the bills. Where they sent out some huge bills, and then
yeah. So that was due to supply, the increase in supply prices, and it was because of the spike in natural gas prices, and we're also now more dependent on fossil, as I mentioned, with the closure of Indian Point. So you know, we felt that impact of that spike even more. Now, communities like New Paltz and Marbletown that are in a CCA and had, you know, have a fixed rate that was negotiated for their supply contract, you know, they didn't have that spike. On the other hand, the previous year, when gas prices like took a dive and were really low, they were paying like, you know, more than the average. Fossil fuel prices are volatile. That is their nature, but the quicker we get off of them, the better. I do want to, Janet raised a really important point, and they've been raised a couple of times in this. It is absolutely, I agree with you. It's not about just generating renewable energy. It's about dealing with consumption. Yes. and reducing our consumption of energy. And that has to be first. Like, that's like the first order of business, is to reduce how much we use. And there's actually, you know, there's a target in the climate law, an energy efficiency target, reducing energy use by 185 trillion BTUs from 2025. And the whole like renewable energy standard update assumes that we are meeting that energy efficiency target you know, so it's like, it's really critical. And, you know, energy efficiency is a big piece of it, but, you know, just using less is a big piece of it, and conserving energy. And it's like, the word conservation has like left our vocabulary with the 1970s, and it really has to come back, you know, because as you point out, we use much more than we need to use, and we have to be thoughtful about our energy use. But energy efficiency, improving efficiency is of our buildings. And, you know, there's our building infrastructure in New York State. We have some of the oldest building stock in the country. There are over 6 million buildings in New York State. 3/4 of them were built before there were any energy codes. You know, I live in a house that's 140 years old, and have been like trying to, you know, plug all of the leaks and, you know, insulate the attic and insulate, and, you know, it's a lot of work, and it's costly. It can be costly. And again, this goes back also to incentives and providing the assistance for people to make these upgrades. Nearly half of New York State households are low and moderate income, and they, you know, can't afford to make those investments. So we as a state have to increase support and assistance to make those investments possible, so that people can reduce their energy use. But that point is extremely well taken. That is like the number one thing, is reducing energy use. And it's the most cost-effective thing we can do.
Okay. So also related to Central Hudson, this is a question I've seen a lot. Customers of Central Hudson can choose their energy provider. A few of these providers obtain their power from renewable sources, with a percentage of renewables varying. Can we rely on the information from these providers? Is this a reasonable alternative to individual or community renewable sources?
Well, so ESCOs, these energy supply companies, you know, got into a lot of trouble because they were taking advantage of customers and were not honest in their advertising, and they're engaging in all kinds of predatory behavior at some point. Not all of them, but some of them. There was a proceeding of the Public Service Commission to more tightly regulate them. But you know, can the information be trusted? I guess, you know, my you know, the way I would approach that question is just generally, if you want to support renewable energy in New York, it's I think better to participate in it. If you can't actually site it in your house, like the sort of priority order, if you can't site it on your house, then participate in a community renewable project in your area, in your region. That is supporting local development, local jobs, local, and investment in your area, and you're guaranteed a discount. If you sign up for, or participate, in a CCA, and CCAs, as I said, are now also going to be able to offer, or opt out participation in community renewable projects. If you just sign up with an ESCO, that's, you're not guaranteed a discount on your bill, and it is not local energy necessarily. So,
okay. Have there been communities that have actually determined by zoning code what private land can be used by a landowner energy company to build a large distributed solar facility? If so, which ones? And did the process used to develop the zoning code pit neighbor against neighbor?
Well, yeah, I mean, there are actually quite a few communities across New York State. So in New York, there are 1,600 municipalities. And as you know, we are what they call a home rule state. So each community can adopt its own local zoning, and it's supposed to do that in compliance with a comprehensive plan. So just like any other kind of land use, right, whether it's industrial or agricultural or residential, zoning code will divide a municipality up into zoning districts and then dictate what kinds of uses are permitted or not permitted. So in that way, you know, if you adopt a solar zoning law that allows distributed energy solar or community solar projects, projects of that scale, then yeah, there are quite a few communities out there that have done that. As I mentioned, the NYSERDA local guidebook, there is a model solar code there. And then we have our recommendations that are in the How to Solar Now toolkit. So there's quite a few across the state. Whether or not that local zoning process, which is a legislative process, right, which would be subject to public comment under you know, municipal home rule processes, whether or not they pitted neighbor against neighbor at that time, I don't know. I haven't heard about a local zoning process that has had that impact. I have heard of local zoning processes that were commenced because a community might have had a number of projects being proposed. So then they put in place what's called a moratorium to sort of have a pause while figuring out exactly where and what kind of solar they do want to permit in the town. And I have also heard of solar zoning laws that have been adopted that have been quite restrictive in terms of size and the types of projects that can be built. But, you know, a neighbor against neighbor thing is not anything that I have heard of.
Okay. Are potential developers, this is a large scale solar projects, I don't know, anyway, given enough profit incentive under current New York law to incentivize them to initiate projects and approach various municipalities, rather than waiting for the municipality to make the approach. So is there an incentive for developers to initiate projects? They're talking
So,
about large scale in
yeah,
the question, but I
I
think
mean,
it expanded.
developers have to have and seek out a willing landowner. They can't build a project unless there's a landowner that wants to like rent their land to host these projects. You know, and they, you know, look at maps and look at where the transmission facilities are, what the land looks like, and, you know, they reach out directly to landowners about potential projects. Yeah, that's how it works.
It might be useful also to explain the different processes that are in place to encourage large-scale renewable projects versus the distributed projects under the New York Sun. So as I mentioned, New York Sun is like an incentive structure where they actually, they separate the state out into regions. There's sort of the Con Ed region and then the upstate region. And they say, okay, first there was a 6 gigawatt goal, now there is a 10 gigawatt goal. And they say, in order to achieve that, we want to build 1,500 megawatts in this region, right? And then they have a certain amount of money that is geared towards those incentives that are sort of tacked on in terms of the compensation that the project gets for the energy generated. And so that's sort of that market incentive based structure. But the large scale renewable projects, it's actually more like an auction. And what NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research Development Authority, does is it puts out a request for proposals for large scale projects, and then developers. And so I think somebody asked the question, who are the developers? We keep saying this, who, you know, developers. And so Some of the common names are Cypress Creek or EDF Renewables or Next Era. So they're companies that have been formed to basically get projects permitted and built, and then probably what they do is they turn it over to somebody else to then operate and manage the actual facility. But that large scale renewables auction based process, what they do is they award a contract to the winning developers to purchase what they call renewable energy credits from them. So it's sort of a different kind of process that incentivizes those different markets. So that makes a kind of a difference when answering that question.
It's very helpful. Very
There's
clear.
also a very complicated process for the utilities to compensate projects for distributed projects called the value of distributed renewable energy, that the value stack, I think Audrey referred to, that takes into account the environmental value of the project, the system benefits of the project, the extent to which it helps reduce, peak demand, these kinds of things. And the idea is that we'll encourage projects that are more beneficial to the system and discourage those that are less. But the working group that I had mentioned earlier, that Audrey, that we both mentioned that we're on, has been giving input to NYSERDA on this scorecard that is going to be used. It was actually an early iteration of it was applied to their last solicitation for large scale renewable projects, just to collect information from developers about their projects. But the intent of this scorecard, when it's developed, is to apply, as NYSERDA is going to use it to evaluate projects, project proposals during the solicitation process. And it's based on a hierarchy of strategies of avoiding the things that we want to avoid, which is avoiding prime agricultural soils, mineral soils 1 to 4, avoiding wetlands and forests and those resources that are important to preserve for all of their ecosystem benefits and for carbon sequestration, where they can't avoid, to minimize their impacts on those resources, and the last, to the extent whatever's left that they can't avoid, minimize, they have to mitigate.
Okay.
This is the point of this whole exercise, is to really steer projects to the best locations from all of these standpoints, from a resource standpoint, a farmland standpoint, etc.
Thank you. So we have to stop. There's still some questions, but we have to stop. And thank you so much. This was wonderful, wonderful presentations and Q&A. And I thank everybody for the questions you sent in. We will be sending out an email that will include a lot of what was been said tonight in terms of the links that you can then go to, as well as some other possibilities for action. And we hope you come back for our third event, which will be held on Monday evening, March 28th. It is called Land in Black Hands, and the program will explore how communities of color in the Hudson Valley are working to create food and agricultural cooperatives. Leaders of these communities will share both the challenges and the victories they have experienced in their endeavors. And there will be a video highlighting these leaders, after which there'll be a Q&A, much like tonight, with Shaniqua Bowden, Head of Cultural Engagement at Kingston Land Trust. And
Looks like a great program.
Yeah, we are trying for, changing the rules before the game is over.
Please, everyone, check out the draft scoping plan and submit comments. It's so important. It's our future. Last plug.
Thank you again.
Thank you very much. Good night, everybody.